August 1977. Inside are documents that will shatter America's trust in its own media. For 30 years, the CIA had been secretly paying journalists, editors, and news executives to plant stories, suppress others, and shape what millions of Americans believed to be independent reporting. The senator clears his throat and begins to read. What emerges over the next 3 hours will reveal how the agency turned America's free press into an instrument of propaganda. The operation had a name: Mockingbird. And if you watched the news, read a newspaper, or opened a magazine between 1950 and 1977, you were likely consuming information crafted not in newsrooms, but in the shadowy corridors of Langley. The year is 1947. America emerges from World War II as a global superpower, but victory brings new anxieties. The Soviet Union, once an ally, now looms as an existential threat. In smoke-filled rooms across Washington, a consensus forms. This new Cold War will be fought not just with weapons, but with words, ideas, and information. The newly formed Central Intelligence Agency understands that winning hearts and minds requires controlling what people read, hear, and believe. Frank Wisner, a tall, charismatic lawyer from Mississippi, becomes the architect of this media manipulation campaign. As head of the CIA's Office of Policy Coordination, Wisner possesses both the authority and the budget to recruit an army of willing collaborators. His mission is deceptively simple: ensure that American media serves American interests in the global struggle against communism. But Wisner faces a challenge. The American press prides itself on independence. Journalists see themselves as watchdogs, not lapdogs of government. How do you co-opt an institution built on the principle of speaking truth to power? The answer, Wisner discovers, lies not in coercion, but in cooperation. Many publishers, editors, and reporters are already ideologically aligned with Cold War objectives. They simply need direction, resources, and occasionally payment. The media landscape of 1950 makes this infiltration surprisingly feasible. A handful of newspapers and magazines shape national opinion. 3 television networks control what Americans see each evening. A few wire services determine which stories reach local newsrooms across the country. Control these choke points, and you control the national conversation. By 1950, Wisner's recruitment operation is in full swing. His targets aren't struggling freelancers or small-town reporters, but the titans of American journalism. Philip Graham, publisher of The Washington Post, becomes an early and enthusiastic participant. Graham's wife, Catherine, would later describe how her husband regularly consulted with CIA officials about coverage decisions and editorial positions. The New York Times proves equally accommodating. Publisher Arthur Hayes Sulzberger allows the agency to place operatives within the newsroom under journalist cover. These aren't just sources or contacts. They're CIA employees with press credentials, filing stories crafted in Langley. The paper's foreign correspondents become a particular focus. Why recruit spies when journalists already travel freely, ask probing questions, and file detailed reports? Henry Luce, the media mogul behind Time, Life, and Fortune magazines, transforms his publications into instruments of American foreign policy. Stories are spiked, angles are adjusted, and entire narratives are shaped to support CIA objectives. When the agency needs to promote a particular interpretation of events in Guatemala or Iran, Luce's magazines provide the perfect vehicle. But Operation Mockingbird extends far beyond these flagship publications. The agency cultivates relationships with columnists like Joseph Alsop, whose syndicated pieces appear in hundreds of newspapers. Alsop doesn't just report CIA-friendly perspectives. He actively coordinates with agency officials to craft stories that serve operational needs. Book publishers join the network, ensuring that CIA-authored or sponsored works reach American readers. Even comic book companies are recruited to the cause. The recruitment process is often surprisingly straightforward. Many journalists genuinely believe they're serving their country. The agency appeals to their patriotism, their anti-communist convictions, and their desire to be on the inside of important events. Some receive direct payments. Others are offered exclusive access, travel opportunities, or career advancement. A few are compromised through personal indiscretions and pressured into cooperation. What begins as occasional favors gradually becomes systematic control. The agency doesn't need to dictate every story, just the ones that matter. By the mid-1950s, Operation Mockingbird has evolved into a sophisticated propaganda machine. The CIA now has assets in virtually every major American news organization. More than 400 journalists worldwide are either on the agency's payroll or regularly cooperating with its objectives. The line between journalism and intelligence has effectively disappeared. The operation's reach becomes evident during major Cold War crises. When the CIA orchestrates the 1953 coup in Iran, American newspapers dutifully report that the Shah has been restored by popular uprising, not foreign intervention. The agency's role remains hidden. When Guatemalan President Jacobo Arbenz threatens United Fruit Company's interests in 1954, American media portrays him as a dangerous communist rather than a democratically elected leader attempting land reform. Newspapers as a liberation, not a violation of sovereignty. The Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 reveals both the power and the limitations of the agency's media influence. The New York Times learns of the impending invasion, but agrees to downplay the story at the CIA's request. Publisher Orville Dreyfus removes references to CIA involvement and timing details. The sanitized version that appears provides cover for the operation, but also demonstrates how America's newspaper of record has become complicit in government deception. Carl Bernstein's later investigation would reveal the staggering scope of this media penetration. The CIA had relationships with journalists at ABC, NBC, CBS, Time, Newsweek, the Associated Press, United Press International, Reuters, and dozens of smaller publications. Foreign correspondents were particularly valuable assets. Their reporting from conflict zones shaped by agency priorities rather than journalistic judgment. The manipulation wasn't limited to news coverage. The agency funded cultural magazines like Encounter and the Paris Review, using them to promote American values and undermine Soviet influence among intellectuals. Book publishing became another front in the information war, with the CIA either directly funding or secretly purchasing and distributing works that supported American foreign policy objectives. Some journalists knew exactly what they were doing. Others believed they were simply maintaining valuable government sources. A few may have been unaware of the agency's role in shaping their assignments and story angles, but the cumulative effect was undeniable. American media had become an extension of American intelligence, serving not the public's right to know, but the government's need to control information. The human cost of this deception was enormous. Americans made political decisions based on incomplete or false information, interventions that were justified through manipulated media coverage. The very foundation of democratic discourse, an informed citizenry receiving accurate information from independent sources, had been quietly undermined. The facade begins to crack in the 1960s. The Vietnam War proves too large and too visible to manage through traditional media manipulation. Television brings images of combat into American living rooms, creating a credibility gap between official statements and observable reality. Younger journalists, less deferential to authority, begin asking harder questions about government claims. The Watergate scandal delivers a fatal blow to the cozy relationship between intelligence agencies and news organizations. The same investigative techniques that expose Richard Nixon's corruption inevitably turn toward other government secrets. In 1975, Senator Frank Church launches congressional investigations into intelligence abuses. The media operations that once seemed patriotic now appear sinister. Carl Bernstein's 1977 Rolling Stone article, "The CIA and the Media," provides the most comprehensive public accounting of Operation Mockingbird. Bernstein reveals that the agency's media operations were far more extensive than previously known, involving major news organizations that had never publicly acknowledged their cooperation. The article's publication coincides with the Senate Intelligence Committee's investigation, creating a perfect storm of scrutiny. The CIA officially terminates Operation Mockingbird in 1976, though critics argue that media manipulation simply became more sophisticated and deniable. Director William Colby promises that the agency will no longer maintain paid relationships with accredited journalists, but the definition of accredited leaves considerable wiggle room. Many of the journalists involved in Operation Mockingbird faced no consequences. Some, like Joseph Alsop, acknowledged their CIA relationships with little apparent shame, viewing their cooperation as patriotic service during a dangerous period. Others maintained their innocence or claimed they had been manipulated by sources they trusted. The major news organizations implicated in the scandal largely weathered the storm. The Washington Post, the New York Times, and the major networks issued statements promising greater independence, but their fundamental power and influence remained intact. The public's trust in media, however, never fully recovered. Frank Wisner, the operations architect, suffered a mental breakdown in the late 1950s and died by suicide in 1965. He never saw the full exposure of his creation, never witnessed the public reckoning with what he had built. Perhaps that was a mercy. Operation Mockingbird succeeded brilliantly at its intended goal, shaping American public opinion to support Cold War objectives. But it also corrupted the very institutions democracy depends upon to function. The legacy persists in our current era of media skepticism and conspiracy theories. When people question whether they can trust what they read or watch, they're responding partly to the revelation that for decades, they couldn't. Operation Mockingbird didn't just manipulate specific stories, it poisoned the well of public trust in journalism itself. The most chilling aspect of Operation Mockingbird wasn't its scope, but how easily it was accomplished. Journalists who saw themselves as independent watchdogs became willing partners in government deception. The promise of access, the appeal to patriotism, the gradual erosion of boundaries, these proved more effective than any authoritarian crackdown could have been. In the end, America didn't need to destroy its free press. It simply convinced the press to destroy itself.